But as it says, I'm Simon Green from Green Building Design. I've been doing dilapidations for various building surveyors, end users, and landlords and tenants with advice for now probably close to 20 years. During that time, I suppose I've worked for the largest, the grandest independent people, single landlords, multi landlords, and tenants of all shapes and sizes. So I've got a really good, unique brief of dilapidations, and so having worked with so many different building surveyors, some very good, and some maybe not so good, and very old surveyors with experience and young ones without experience. I feel that I've got a lot of experience now with dilaps. And I think for a building surveyor, often the building surveyor spends shorter periods of time on site than I do. And the building surveyor potentially can measure a lot of his from drawings, the walls, the floors, the areas, and have your rates and build up your spot schedule that way. But for the engineer, every building is absolutely unique. The fit outs are unique. The services that go inside them are unique. And very little of that information is on drawings. And therefore, really, that engineer needs to be encouraged, in my opinion, to spend a lot more time on site than maybe you, the building surveyor, does. And really, the only way that we can... Sorry, can you let those people in? Yeah, okay, thanks. The only way that we will get you a good schedule is by spending that time on site and working with you. Now, obviously, the protocol has been around for quite a considerable period of time now. And, it felt to me that when I was reading through the protocol, it has some great ideas and all of that. But it really felt that the engineers who potentially either go do their survey after you've done yours or get added on as an afterthought because you've been to site and realised there's a lot of M&E there, is that, to get the best out of us, you really need to help us and give us a good brief. As engineers, we are taught old age disrepair. So we are inclined to look at an old chiller or an old boiler and think, well, that needs to be replaced because it's 20 years old and it's knackered. Clearly, that's not what the lease says, that's not what the dilapidations say. So, to get the best out of us, you need to give us a really good brief. You need to talk to us about landlord improvements, supersession articles, guide us on what that lease says, guide us to the right paragraphs of repair, of reinstatement, or anything odd in there. And, if you've read in the lease that, the reinstatement is only valid if the landlord instructs within 3 months of the lease, let us know those things so that we can then, get our schedules turned around in good time. And bring us in as part of that team. And without that help, you're not going to get the best out of us. And, maybe you've got to pick an engineer and spend a couple of years educating him on leases and educating him on what you want, on what goes in the schedule, and invest in that time. And, bear in mind that schedule could be 40% of the claim. Sometimes it could be higher. And, it could be a large part of the money you're missing out on if you haven't guided your engineer properly. Obviously, with the quantum demand, to keep us honest, and I think the dilapidation protocol is really a good way of trying to keep us honest. Should this building surveyor, endorse their quantified demand. Now, normally, if I'm doing this to a room full of faces, I'll ask for the hands to go up. So we'll gloss over that bit. But I mean, fundamentally, my next question is, should the engineers endorse their part of the claim? If you're asking us to go into a legally defined document, which could be a claim for breaches, should I be writing down any old things? Oh, £10,000 for this, £20,000 for that. It doesn't really matter. Or should I actually be being told that actually it's really important to get your schedule absolutely as right as possible and correct as possible, because that could be the one you're going to court on. And I think if the engineers understand what they're doing a bit more, and maybe if they've got to sign their part of the claim, then maybe you will focus them a little bit more. So, I wonder whether the protocol should, when you read it, it doesn't actually mention engineers, it's only ever talking about building surveyors. And as we're a big part of that claim, I wonder whether, we need to be brought into that process a little bit more. Now, as I said earlier on, the engineering inside every building is unique. It's different for every client, different installer, different commissioning, different number of changes. So to try and get that schedule as right as possible at day one, and nobody likes inflated claims that quickly get knocked down to 30% and settled. If we can try and understand the services at day one, should the engineer and the building surveyor go to site before we write the schedules, walk through the building, have a good overview and understanding of the legal position, the landlord's intentions, what the tenants have done, what they haven't done, and have one building surveyor who is very, very good at giving me that detail before we go to site. And I have the other extreme of things is, a surveyor says, I'll go to site. Okay, can you send me the leases? Yeah, I haven't got those yet. Okay, what do you want me to do? Well, I don't really know. You make it up. You're putting an awful lot on me as an engineer to come up with a good schedule that isn't full of contradictions compared to your schedule. I'm stripping the T point out, but from something you've read that the T point was installed by the landlord's only got to be cleaned and repaired. Those inconsistencies. So if you and the engineer go together, we can talk about the services, we can look what's there, understand what we think they have and haven't done, and then potentially go back to the lawyer with that information and then get some clear instruction, that what has been installed, what is there, and maybe at that first round, the engineer does provide a list of services and their condition. I've called it there, services installed condition schedule. So we really talk about what's there, and then you, the building surveyor, have your expertise of the leases, and the lawyer with the expertise of what should and shouldn't be asked for, and then to give us an accurate response to what we can and cannot ask for. So then when we go and write our stock schedule, it's had the right information from us about what's there, what we think has been installed by who, by when, its condition. We can bring in the agent and really, really try and hone down that schedule so that we're getting an accurate, proper engineered schedule, which is the same quality as the building surveyor schedule in the same lines, without having a Scott schedule with obvious errors in there, overinflation, or even things missed. And that's something maybe to think about as a slightly different way of doing it. I know people can argue that there's some front loading of fees with that, because potentially we've both got to go twice. But if that then gives you an accurate schedule, but be it be high, be it be low, but be it be accurate in line with the protocol, that then you can go to the tenants and say, it's not 1 million of overinflated claims, it's only 400,000. And you can quickly agree on the scope of works. Either they do the works, or you get a cash settlement, or you do the works, and then we don't have a long, protracted, drawn out claim that's going on for years, where the landlord's done a claim that's not great, and the tenants are just ignoring it or being very clever with it, and years later we still haven't got it settled. And I'm definitely a honest believer that 99% of landlords don't want dilapidation claims dragging out for years and years and years. And I think 99% of tenants don't want them either, because that full liability they need to show on their books now with the accountancy rules. And if there is, millions of pounds on there that are not due, they've got to show that on their loss for that year, and obviously cover that until it gets resolved. So, it's my idea really that, with my experience, that, a meeting first on to really understand and crystallise what the loss is, what the tenants have done, its condition, what they haven't done, what the landlord wants, is a way then of trying to brief your engineer in a much more pragmatic way on each building. The other option to consider, if as often I do, I know both building surveyors on both sides of the fence. Therefore, is there an opportunity that, as the engineering is so difficult to define on each building, should you consider the role of a joint expert from day one? Now, I appreciate that there's a trust there, but the engineer should be acting in the best interest of both parties. He should be acting expertly, independently, in line with the protocol, and not putting inflated claims in, or silly claims on the other side if you're the tenant and saying things that aren't wrong when they clearly are wrong. So is that a way to try and narrow some of these issues, and hopefully lead to claims being agreed and settled much quicker, and not having long protracted claims where quite frankly I think quite a few landlords are getting fed up. The tenants won't pay anything, and tenants getting fed up, landlords asking for everything and the costs for it to be refurbed. And is there a way there we can try and narrow some of the process at the start? So hopefully that's something to think about. We're going to then now go on to talk a bit more about statutory compliance, because clearly that is a huge problem inside leases about at what point is the tenant liable for statutory compliance. You know, obviously during the lease they're reliable, but then once they finish their lease, are they reliable for current legislation, or is it a case that they should have reinstated that statutory compliance? So we're going to touch on phasing out refrigerant gases. Also, we can talk about some ageing and central plant. Water corrosion is also a difficult subject inside enclosed conditions. And then we're also going to talk about electrical and sort of systems that are over 20 years old and some of the problems that can give us. So I'm going to do that with a couple of examples, which typically would give you what we see at the moment. This is called a VRF system, or more commonly might be called an air source heat pump. They're exactly the same things. They use refrigerant technology under pressure to either extract heat from the building and extract it to outside, or in reverse in the winter. They can use they can lower their temperature of their coil, which can then take latent heat from the air, and then they can use that latent heat to heat the buildings. So thinking about the uniqueness, this is a 10-year-old VRF system. So typically it has a lifespan of 15 years if it's been well maintained and well installed. If it's at the coast, it could have potentially a lower lifespan because the salt can corrode the coils quite badly. But typically we're looking at 15 years. Now, what's really important to think about with this building is it's an old, typical London aged Victorian building. So it's got single glazed windows, brick built walls, and has a reasonable heating load. And obviously can be used for cooling in the summer. And that's probably quite good for the engineer to understand how the building's been used. And that type of unit in London will potentially have a harder life because it's doing a lot of heating. And the whole process of these units is as it takes latent heat from the outside air using a cold surface, at some point that cold surface gets frosty and condensation appears on that metal surface. It gets colder and colder, and eventually that moisture will freeze. Now, once it's all frozen, the unit detects that and knows that. It then goes into reverse, and it takes a little bit of heat from the building and then puts that heat on those coils, raises its temperature, melts off all the ice, and it all drops away. So if you go on a roof somewhere and you see one of these units with a lot of water underneath, that's either condensating in summer mode or it's de-thawing in winter mode, and they're designed to do that. So thinking about the DLAPs, it's 10 years old. We have a quick look to check it's what sort of refrigerant it's got, and it's got 407C, so it's not on the ban list yet. Manufactured in 2006. So this slide perhaps needs to be refreshed and it's a little bit old, a little bit dated. But you can see that the faceplate's giving you nothing other than saying that it's 10 years old, and the gas is okay. It's not an R22 gas or banned gas. So this is then the coils. So this is where the heat transfer happens either between the air, and all of those little fins are able to either take heat in the winter or extract heat in the summer. There's a little bit of damage there on the coil, so we can ask for that coil to be combed out and smoothed up. And then when you get on your bottom and look right at the bottom, that's your central plate heat exchanger. And that is, as you can see, is in quite bad condition. Now, because I've said earlier, this unit's obviously done a lot of heating. That means that's had a lot of freezing on there. Now, this building hadn't had great maintenance and it was quite dirty. And what's really happened at the bottom there is you've had a lot of dirt, I guess would be the right word, and mess from the roads. It's got in between those coils. Those coils have then obviously frozen and caused stress on those things. And those fins are very, very thin. A lot of heating, a lot of cooling, a lot of freezing, a lot of dirt, and you can see it damaged the fins. And we actually found there was a leak at the bottom of that unit, and we was able then to really sort of say that it actually come to the end of its life and wasn't in a good position or good condition to continue being used. And there was a section of the coil that was also broken. So again, it just shows there that you've got a 10-year unit there. I'm sorry. If you perhaps go on to mute, please, and then we'll take questions at the end. Thanks so much. So there's a 10-year-old unit there that has failed before its recommended life, and that's failed dominantly because of the nature of the installation, lack of maintenance, and it's had a hard heating life. To give you some examples, then we go to the next extreme. These units were installed. They were high quality units installed in a data center in Kersley in Manchester. They're 20 years old. They're R22, so in theory they should be replaced. This is doing a data center, which means it's always having heat rejected. So you think of those fins at the back, they're always having heat on them. So if you get any wet weather on them, obviously the heat is drying them off. Because it's a data center, they're getting really, really high quality maintenance. And those units working there at 20 years old are perfectly good as they were as the day went in. So that's the problem with engineering. The previous slide showed you early failure through hard work and lack of maintenance. And here you've got hard work, good maintenance, good quality, different side of scenario, 20 years plus, and they're still working. In fact, those units are now 25 years old, and they're only being changed because the client is going down a global change to remove refrigerants and global warming gases from their installations. But they could probably quite happily work for another 5 years without issues. We're going to just briefly talk about Versatemp units. Now, it's a phrase that agents seem to hate and say, oh, that building's got horrible Versatemp units, get them out. They're noisy units, they don't work very well. Well, if they're Versatemp units, they're probably 25 years old if they're in London. And the refrigerant, or that cycle thing, so you have a compressor, a heat exchanger, and a fan to push out the air, is all located in that one box. In this picture, it's located in the ceiling. Often in offices, they'll be located under the windows. And the agent will probably be telling you that the worst thing in the world, they're noisy, they don't work very well, they're rattly, they're horrible. And the chances are they are a bit noisy and a bit rattly. They're 25 years old. And what happens is the refrigerant cycle is all enclosed within that grey unit. And it will take water from the red pipes on the left-hand side of that picture. And depending on which mode you're in, that water typically is between about 12 and about 20 degrees. So if it's in the winter, the boilers will be adding heat to that pipework. And if it's in the summer, that pipe will be being chilled by central plant. And basically, like the heat exchanger that we saw in the outside picture, it's taking that energy from that water onto the plate heat exchanger and using refrigerant cycles, either extracting heat from that or taking heat from the space and extracting hot water to that pipework. So it's quite an efficient machine, which is why they were put in. In fact, it's very, very efficient machines. It can heat and cool the buildings very efficiently. One side of the building can be used to heat or cool the other side. So it ends up working, very, very well. And because that refrigerant cycle is enclosed within that unit, these units can basically last, very, very long time. The person that's just joined, can you go on to mute, please? Thank you. And those units there, they're 37 years old, still working happily. It's working in a bank, in Lloyds Bank, in Milton Keynes. And Milton Keynes, that office hasn't ever really moved the bank hall units around. They've always been in occupations, they've always been used. And that actually has R502 gas inside, which was banned in 1985. So again, if that unit breaks and fails on the refrigerant cycle, it would have to be replaced or refurbished or upgraded. But at the moment, they're working really, really well on high quality installation that has good maintenance and hasn't had any refurbishment. So you've got a 37-year-old Versatemp unit there working really, really well. Compare that then to the next slide. This was a very, very large project I did with Dilapidations. Now the tenant had a 20-year lease. Sorry, beg your pardon, a 25-year lease. And we were coming towards the end of the lease. And they had done lots and lots of subleases because the space had changed for their business over that period of time. Periods of time where the buildings were empty, so things were isolated. lots and lots of changes of tenants coming in. So these things were being disconnected, moved around. A lot of work, and a lot of things that we can consider for engineering. And going back to my first slide, where educating your engineer and explaining about the building. Now, this tenant had made a decision that they weren't going to replace these Verstep units on a like-for-like basis, which was typically about £1,800 to buy one, and then obviously got to get it installed. But they were going to send, I think they bought a batch of new ones, which gave them a stock. And then every time that stock had failed, they then sent them in a lorry to a place to get them refurbished. So because they were R22, we had to put new compressors in, which is the large unit on the right hand side. And they had a bit of a controls overgrade. They acid cleaned all of the coils and heat exchangers to make sure they were nice and new, and then brought them back to site. Some worked fine, some didn't. They found that the journey travelling in the lorry had then caused some electrical faults. Back again they went, electrical faults to be repaired. Then they found, a bit later on, some of the fan decks were failing. This plant doesn't like travelling, and certainly this old plant doesn't like travelling. But you had this whole, big, large picture of a gradual refurbishment plateau with the tenants, and it became very, very difficult for us to assess actually at lease end date what was going to actually be in fault on that lease end date. And I think the landlord wanted obviously all to be replaced, but we couldn't ask for that, and the tenants probably admitted that they should have been replacing these units when they failed, not refurbishing them and repairing them. And the costs of them going back to the manufacturers 3, 4 and sometimes 5 times were outweighing the cost of just buying a new one. And we had a compromise deal where the tenants basically paid for 25% of the units to be replaced. And that was down to us doing a lot of diligence, looking at them, validating them, and really having that whole picture of the units hadn't been looked after great during the 25 years, had a lot of moving, but wasn't a straightforward solution for us to resolve on how to come up with a suitable, satisfactory answer for landlord and tenant. And you can imagine the landlord wasn't particularly happy either that he had about 60% of the units potentially to replace once he took back his lease. But that's where the engineer can really help on the negotiation with those claims, with that validation and seeing what was happening. So if we move on to central plant, if you look at one of my typical schedules, the gas absorption chiller, so that would be working with your Verstep units, the central thing that's providing chilled water to your building. I went in the room, incredibly noisy, really, really noisy, lots of vibration. So typically, therefore, we had on our spot schedule, manufacturer to test, inspect, a report on any fault, £750. And then a provisional sum, and I know building spares will strike that through, that the provisional sums don't exist, but at least it was set in the scene that there was going to be some repairs needed to that chiller. And we basically encouraged with the landlord to have a validation done of the 25-year-old gas absorption chiller. So there it was in the basement. You physically would have a real job getting it out. The manufacturers confirmed that each of those compressors on the top, those 4 compressors, were all R22. 2 had catastrophic failures and were leaking, so they had to be replaced. The large tube at the bottom of that picture is the heat exchanger. That hadn't been cleaned either, and there was various other sensors that should have been changed regularly, hadn't been changed. We had quite a list for that unit that totaled about £18,000. Cost to replace that in its location underground was going to be incredibly difficult, probably somewhere between 50 and 100 grand to get it in and out. But once we've done these £18,000 worth of repairs that were needed, they felt the chiller had another good 5 to 10 years life. So, I felt I had justified my claim there with Dilapidations to have that chiller repaired. And what we also found was that heat exchanger was completely blocked. Now that heat exchanger goes off to a unit on the roof called a cooling tower, which extracts the heat that the chiller makes from its system of taking the heat out of the building. Now, what we also had noticed was in the corner of the room was this pump, and this was what's called the condensate pump, and that was obviously moving the water from the chiller up to the unit on the roof. Now, clearly, if it's lying on the floor and you can see all of the scale inside, I kind of knew there was going to be some problems with that pump, with that pipe work, and obviously with the heat exchanger. So we basically then went forward to ask for water samples. and found that, that pipe was heavily scaled up with the chemicals that are used to clean that unit. And obviously it gave us that evidence, therefore, to confirm that pipe would need to be cleaned. Now, this then led us on to the steel cooling tower on the roof, and that unit links with the one downstairs with that pipe work. And a little bit of history about cooling towers. Cooling towers are fantastic, efficient ways of getting rid of heat from building. They're about 25% more efficient than your air source heat pump. And the reason for that is because inside that tin box, you have water being sprayed over the coils. And when the coils are wet, they're obviously able to extract the heat at a much, much higher efficiency than if those coils were dry. The problem is that those temperatures that get extracted off of there are between sort of 35 to 55, which is the perfect breeding temperature for the bugs like Legionella to develop. So the water that's being sprayed around there is heavily treated and has lots of chemicals in it to make sure that there's no Legionella bugs being multiplied and breeding. Because there's been a few legal cases where people have been sued and put in prison for manslaughter for these things becoming not maintained properly, like at Preston Tower. Therefore, councils are super, super cautious of anybody with a cooling tower on their patch. And probably in reality, any cooling tower is so carefully monitored by the local council, and really, it's pressed upon the tenants that they have to maintain it properly, that almost anything that the people ask for with cooling towers gets done. So usually on a building, the cooling towers are in great maintenance. And indeed, we got a maintenance report done, a validation report done by the manufacturers on this tower. And they basically found that there wasn't really anything wrong with it, other than it was a bit rusty. That the shifts and the diffs have been replaced every 18 months. And then because it's kind of metal is sitting inside a rusty tin box that you're spraying water over, that rust and corrosion was immediately transferred into the shifts and diffs, and hence they were changing them all over about 18 months. So from a dilapidations point of view, there was a bit of a question about should the tenant be paying for the validation report, because we didn't really find much wrong. But the advice from the manufacturers was, you know what, you're paying about 18,000 a year maintaining this aging rusty steel box. If you paid about 25,000 and put a stainless steel one in, your maintenance costs are going to drop down to probably a couple of thousand a year for the next 10 years, because the stainless steel won't be corroding. So in the end, the tenant signed for another lease for another 10 years, and there was a compromise deal done where the landlord paid to have that chiller, that cooling tower on the roof changed to stainless steel, and the tenants obviously paid their dilapidations for the chiller downstairs. So it got a little bit fuzzy on who was responsible for quite what with the dilapidations, but ultimately the tenant stayed and the landlord was happy because he had another tenant, and we'd understood exactly what was going on between maintenance and the overcost of maintenance against the cost of replacement. So again, it just brings to fore some of the problems with M&E plant, and really the absolute need for validations to prove what condition it's in and what the loss is. Heating systems are always a real difficulty. Obviously, the picture on the left there is showing some corrosion and some leaking. You can see some rust on the pipework. The brass valve is oxidizing and is obviously having the leak. Once a sealed water system gets air into it, that air does cause oxidization and corrosion internally, and that's where your problems can come, that the internal corrosion is obviously a lot worse than the external corrosion. So really, with closed water conditions, really validation and testing and regular testing is essential. The tenants should really be testing those water samples every year and adding chemical inhibitors. And if they do some work by moving it around, so again, thinking about my first chat, we should really be looking as a team, how much relocation of radiators has there been on this job? How many times has the radiators been drained and dropped out, where they relocated and moved fan coils, radiators and chilled water things? Because when you drop water out of these systems, then the inside of the pipework gets full of a dry slush. When you put fresh water through, that obviously washes off, and then you have sludge around the system. So you must, when you're doing refurbishment, properly clean and flush through and chemically clean, and then add inhibitor to these systems. If you don't, they're going to get really corroded on the inside and be a real problem at the end of the lease. So we need to validate, and every time there's an aged water system in your building, you need to get full water samples done. Now, sometimes the tenants will say, oh, well, the maintenance guy does it, and here's the test certificates. And what he'll be doing is he'll be taking one sample a year in the plant room, at the most easiest point, probably next to the pumps, where the water is moving really quick, and probably there isn't too much issues there. If you want to get the water sample done properly, and as a landlord, we would always recommend that, then you need to get water samples done on each floor of your building. We're recently involved in a building that had 4 wings and 4 floors, and therefore we had 16 water samples on the chilled water and 16 water samples on the heating. And the building surveyor, I was arguing that was over the top, until you saw the difference on all of the standards. And the lower down the building you went, the much worse the water quality's got, because that's where the solids tend to sit. And also those fan coils down on the ground floor weren't performing anywhere near, because the water couldn't get through to them. And a lot of that water then is sitting on the inside of the plate heat exchangers, so the water can't transfer to the space. Now, I bring in that picture on the right hand side because we was in a unit, and the building surveyor spent a year arguing with me that radiator did not need replacing and could just be cleaned quickly. Now, I don't know what people are like with their idea of cleaning, but that radiator is 150 quid to get supplied, installed and changed. I think you can all agree it's going to cost you more than that to try and clean that thing and get all the rust off of it, treat all the rust and paint it. But if the engineer has been reasonable and asking for things, I think building surveyors need to be very reasonable back. And if you've got engineers on the other side, to ask them to be reasonable as well, because we spent a year arguing that case, and it was on the verge of going to court all the way around that building. And some more slides on that building in a minute, where you'll see where they were arguing supersession and bits and pieces. But one of the big things was, he said the radiators in the toilets were completely acceptable, and I'd hope none of you on this call would agree that radiator was acceptable. So we now move into another thorny area of electrical, and as you can see, this is a 25-year-old electrical. The central oblong in the middle there is a busbar chamber. That's what we did back then. The biggest problem with those is they have cables bolted to them, like the picture that's showing you inside that cover, a bit lower down. And electricians now are much more worried about fault currents and what are called type testing. So while it's on the wall and it's just sitting there, they can give you a electrical condition report or a periodic inspection and say it passes. But then once you start taking out, those large isolators that serve the machines that are in that warehouse, and then you're covering up that busbar section, and then they've got to give you a test certificate for that busbar, it does become very, very difficult for electricians then to start saying, well, this sort of system is non-compliant with code. And it's very, very difficult to know which way to jump as landlord or tenant. And often I kind of think that the tenant should be rather paying for some repairs and cleaning, but the reality is the landlord's going to probably have to put his hand into his pocket and actually replace that wholesale. It does become difficult, but again, we'd be asking for a full ECIR, electrical condition installation report, which will tell you all about the cables and what the faults are. And there is an element possibly of supersession there that the landlord's going to have to replace this anyway, so is the tenant liable for anything? And I think this is where we need possibly more of a rounded approach to things, and a bit more of a, the tenants have allowed that to fall into disrepair. And should the tenant be paying for a new system, or should the landlord, or should it be in a slightly compromised position? And that's where I tried to be with that. So that's some of the problems around statute and an aging kit, which I find is a problems. Looking at the future, I am seeing more and more unreasonable entrenched position from tenant surveyors. I'm also seeing landlords being very, very demanding and asking for a common law schedule to be written with everything in the kitchen sinking. And obviously whoever's paying you, you're going to follow their advice and try and provide a claim that is as high as one can with an element of what's reasonableness. And consequently, if you're the tenant asking you to save as much as you can, you are going to try and save as much as you can. Incentivized fees, as engineers, we never ever get those. We're only on time charge, so we're not too worried with those. And I appreciate incentivized fees are sometimes they're illegal with our RACS and sometimes they're not. I'm not quite sure where you are with that now, but incentivized fees definitely encourage, in my opinion, building surveyors to behave unreasonably. And the way Dilaps are going at the moment, are our clients happy? And I think we all need to take a hard look at that. And I think there's a lot of clients aren't happy. Landlords do not want entrenched things running on for years and years and years. I appreciate if a tenant is refusing to engage, they have no option but spend 2 years and then go to court. And most of the time, I don't believe tenants want these cases hanging over their books for years and years and years. And I have been involved in many cases where, or many projects where potentially a building surveyor on one side is so focused on getting the maximum claim, he's actually scuppering the whole deal. We've been involved recently with a tenant, and they made it very clear that they wanted a cash settlement relatively quickly. And he'd been speaking to the landlord, and the landlord wanted him out slightly early, which he was prepared to do, because he had a long-term tenant liking to come in. And one of the building surveyors, I'm going to say the other side, of course I am, but the other builder on the other side was obsessed that he wanted his claim, and his claim was more important, and it was on the verge of scuppering the deal. And had the tenant personally known the landlord and them been not talking, I can see in a case where the deal would not have gone through. And unfortunately, the agent for the landlord was the same company as the building surveyor for the landlord. And I think he had to have a word internally and told the person to agree a cash deal, which personally, looking at the schedule, the cash deal I thought was over and above that we would have been aiming for if it had been terminal schedule. But the overall deal meant our client, in my opinion, paid too much money. But ultimately, both landlord and tenant were happy. And I think building surveyors doing DLAPs, tenant and landlord, need to look at the wider issue than just the claim. And certainly, you've got engineers that are going up hammer and tong for each other. You can probably control us much more and say, okay, look, guys, come to a deal, come to agree a position. Who's doing what works, or is it a cash settlement? And once a lawyer said to me, or a client said to me, if we're going to court, there's a lunatic in the room, look in the mirror and make sure it's not you. And I think that's some really, really good advice that, yes, we're doing a job, but let's look at the bigger picture as well and make sure our client is happy and we're going down the right direction our client is. I'm only an engineer. I'm not a valuer, and I'm certainly not a building surveyor. And I worry that when people start involved in Section 18 and hypothetically, we're going to put this building as a value in a hypothetical market with a hypothetical buyer in a hypothetical condition and compare that hypothetically with what it is now, and therefore the difference between the two hypothetical figures, that the Section 18 valuer for the tenant is completely miles away from the is for the landlord, and then you're trying to bring that into the equation and drag everything out. And this case here, this is where I had my awful building surveyor that constantly kept on saying, show me the proof that these holes were dug by my tenant that had these 100-ton and 200-ton presses in there. And we were struggling to find the proof because our client, the landlord, had bought the building halfway through the term. But on probability, it's pretty likely those holes weren't there in those exact positions to suit those presses with all those different pieces. And then he was also arguing that the contamination in there was minuscule. And you can see all that oil and stuff in there. And that cost us a lot of time and money. Because of the building surveyor, he refused to engage in us. He refused to pay a penny for that unit. The landlord did all of the works, spent quite a bit more money than the claim, and that was very carefully done with our building surveyor on our side to supersede that and put landlord's things through. And in my opinion, we asked only for exactly what was allowed in our claim with our claim figures, and still the building surveyor's arguing that the costs are expensive, even though they're costs that were finished. 18 months after the lease ended, we'd finished all the works, we'd re-let the building, and we're still arguing with them about the money. And a path 36, Part 38, forgive me, it's not my field, the law was issued in court against the tenants. And at that point, the tenant himself engaged with the landlord and knew, I would say, 5% of what was going on. And I almost got the impression he'd been asking for updates to pay a bill. And, you know, the money he paid, I say he was happy with, no tenant's ever happy to pay, but it was a figure that he was always expecting all the way along. You know, so did that building surveyor work in the right interest of his client there? Dragging out 2 years worth of fees, certainly a lot of paying and extra fees on our part to sort it all out, and being completely unreasonable with everything of the whole claim. And, you know, I ask ourselves, you know, are our clients happy, and are we at risk of landlords and tenants insisting we go over to the American system, where there is no dilapidations and there's a few more quid on the rent, and the landlords maintain the buildings and manage the buildings and do the dilapidations at the end, and we're all going to lose out on a lucrative form of work. So with that thought, I'm going to open up to questions, and hopefully, I know there's not many of us on, but we're not going to be shy, and we'll have a few questions.
Simon,
Hi, Peter.
hi there. Are you being asked with the new accounting regulations and requirement to assess your dilapidations liability during the term? Are you being asked to do validation reports during the term, or is your work almost exclusively on termination?
I would say probably I do an awful lot of terminal dilapidation for tenant and landlord, but I am doing more and more lease end ones. In fact, I had a pretty crazy one last week where I had to go last week, because the wood was going to end, and I got there and there's 2 phases of the fit out going on. Phase 1 has been finished and they've been in 6-8 weeks. Phase 2 doesn't finish until the end of January. And I've got to say, it's bloody difficult to do at the best of times. It's even more so when they haven't actually done anything. Yeah. And you've got lines on the floor and showing me stuff and saying, well, there's be this and be that. So yeah, we're doing it more and more, and refreshing them every 5 years. But what we would do is there's a lot of chat in the Dilapidation Association about quite how we do these. Yeah. Do you do them on pounds per square feet? And I'm of the opinion that the only way I can really do it is almost do a full terminal schedule, go around and list down how many doors have got security on, what they've done and what they haven't done, and list it down quite detailed to give them an accurate number. And then we try and do a bit of a worst case and a best case, to say, well, you've put this shower in the warehouse and this toilet block. The worst case is he wants it stripped out for £10,000, but the best case is he'll take it as a benefit in credit for you, and perhaps £1,000 to leave it clean and in repair, and then give them 2 figures. But yeah, we're seeing much more of it, and in line with the accountancy regulations now. We do need to be doing that, and certainly there's some of these big warehouses that go around that they're having it done every 5 years.
And are you getting those instructions from surveyors or from the tenants themselves?
Typically from the building surveyors. Most of our work comes via building surveyors. There is a few landlord clients we've got and a few lawyers that will obviously ask us to be used either directly to the client or directly to the building surveyor, but the mainstay would be via building surveyors.
And are you getting much pushback on your fees for that? Because obviously this is yet another layer of costs for either landlords or tenants to suffer where they haven't had to in the past.
Yeah, I won't lie. Everyone is telling you that they need it as cheap as possible for whatever reason, and you look at the rents and stuff. But I mean, at the end of the day, our fees, I think we're pretty competitive. Most of the people that know me know we do a diligent, high quality job, and if our fees are £200 more than another engineer, we usually try and justify it by saying, but we'll go to the next level. I mean, as a practice, we count everything, we list everything down. Yeah. I'm involved with a very large legal project that we've been drafted in, well, at the arbitration stage, and I've looked at the M&E schedule, and this is 64,000 square feet office building, and there's 50 M&E breaches. And, you know, one of the M&E breaches, it says strip out data cables, 10 grand. And of course, the other side are being very obnoxious and saying, well, yeah, there's a few come out there. We'll give you 1,000. You know, I now have a schedule. I haven't been on site for 4 days. Well, 3 days, because it's half a day travel each way. 3 days on site, I've got a 550 item schedule. And we've gone and counted the data points. And we've done it on a floor by floor basis and a wing by wing basis. So, you know, there is a lot of repetition in our schedules, but, you know, we can now go to site, we can now look at 10,000 square foot module, right? Well, we've counted these data points. And, you know, and straight away, it doesn't like my budget costs. That's no problem. We've had it tendered by local contractors, and he's still arguing it. But you know, that level of detail, I think, is necessary now. And you know, certainly on a dilapidation, if we're going to go to court, for us to spend, you know, a couple of £1,000 with us doing an M&E schedule, and I mean, from a landlord's point of view, reasonable fees are recovered on most leases. So not only are you getting me doing a detailed dollar schedule and capturing everything in a very, very minute detail, chances are, Mr. Landlord, you're not even paying for it. So why wouldn't you use an engineer on every job? And now I can't service everybody, and I'm not proposing to, and I hope this is not too much of a sales pitch for me on this lecture. But as building surveyors, you've got to find an engineer. You've got to invest your time and energy in training him, and use him all the time. And we have a lot of building surveyors that will almost not do the job if we're not doing it, because they know the M&E people, you know, think old age it is to repair, and you don't get great schedules. Anybody else got a question? Yeah, come off mute and no problem.
Hello, Simon. I do apologise for being late again.
No problem at all. No problem.
Meeting I was trying to get away from. Very interesting what I heard. I was just interested if you get involved at the other end, right at the beginning, with overrunning jobs. So a tenant's going to go into a brand new building with newly commissioned equipment, and it might have been running for several years during a real long delay. I mean, I've been involved in several jobs because they've been delayed. And plant, I mean, lift is a typical example, but mechanical plant, air conditioning plant, etc., could have been running for, you know, maybe years, and with questions as to who should have been maintaining it, or if anyone has.
And I think it would be very fair to say, if a building's been empty for many years by the landlord, there's a huge chance, you know, it hasn't been maintained, you know, or the new plant has just been running with no cleaning, and then the filters are completely filthy because it's picking up all of the, you know, the dust and the legacy dust of new building sites. I mean, certainly we're often doing condition reports on buildings, and we'd always recommend that a condition report is done by a building surveyor and an M&E engineer before you sign the lease. And you know, if the tenants are planning major alterations to it, you know, it's not as common now, but most tenants in London always wanted their own comms room and data hall. You know, the first question we'd always be asking to them is, God's sake, before you sign, let's get a concept license to water agreement to put all that plant on the roof. Because as you know, your full experience is some of those buildings in London is once you've signed, they're very reluctant to give you roof space, but they're much more keen before you sign. So yeah, we would definitely recommend a condition report and maybe some validation if we've got worries from contractors before you sign the lease. Appreciate that it's costs up front, but it's, you know, it's an expensive mistake if you find that, you know, we did a building once, I remember a long time ago with Savills, and beautiful, it was described as beautiful refurbished space. And you went there and the lights looked beautiful. The carpet was beautiful, it was all freshly painted, a new ceiling in it. We took a few ceiling tiles down, and there was 18-year-old fan coils above the ceiling void. And you were signing for 10 years, and you were on the hook for full repairing. I mean, you know, that tenant would have been taking all that lovely ceiling down and those lights and replacing those fan coils at some stage during his lease. You know, probably in the first few years, and that whole deal collapsed. And you know, the Savills agent was pretty pissed off with us because our report cost him that sale. But from the tenant's point of view, we probably saved him 200 grand of plant that the landlord should have replaced. So absolutely essential to get that advice before you sign.
Thank you.
No problem at all. Anybody else? Any questions? No? Well, at 2 minutes to 2 then, I'm going to grab my lunch then, because I'm starving. But any questions, drop us an email, or I mean, Sarah has recorded it, so she'll forward around the comments if there's any questions. But I hope it's useful. I know it's a little bit forward thinking on it, but that's just my opinion of the way our Dilaps world is going over the next few years. And so I'm seeing many different scenarios with different surveyors. But thank you ever so much for joining.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you very much.